Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, today we've got some big news for you, and that's going to be a big part of what we talk about today. If you are a longtime listener to Star Wars Generations podcast or just older episodes of this podcast, you've probably heard one of my favorite guests, Riki Hayashi. Riki has given us great insight on everything from the Clone Wars and Rebels to Gojira movies to the Green Lantern and the Yellow Lanterns and other things like that. And after having him on so many times as a guest, I'm happy to announce that he is going to be the new co host for us here on Superhero Ethics. And he and I had a great conversation about bringing him on and about some of the ways we could kind of adjust where we've been going with this podcast and make some changes to maybe get a little bit closer to what some of the original ideas were and some of Riki's great ideas. So, Riki, let me just first start by saying thank you so much and introduce yourself.
Matthew, thank you so much. I mean, it is a great joy to be joining you always, anytime. I appreciate the insights you have and how it challenges me, how we challenge each other in terms of understanding of our fandom and media and of the topic of this podcast, right? Superhero ethics. Moving perhaps a little bit away from superhero in general, but definitely like fandom ethics, like in terms of our geek fandom. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be a bigger part of this. And like you said, it's maybe like a little refocus on ethical dilemmas within fandom, within media. For those of you who don't know, my name is Riki Hayashi. I am a long time well, I'm not even that. By default, I was about to say I'm a longtime judge. I'm not. I used to be a judge, Magic the Gathering judge. That's how Matthew and I met. And I've moved on to some different games and fandoms and all that, but have always, like, at my root, been a geek, a nerd, and Star Wars, especially, as you may have heard on the other podcast. But I love just everything. I've been a long time comic book fan, like actual comic books, uh, anime, any kind of science fiction, Star Wars, Star Trek, of course. So I'm always excited to talk about them in general, but I have always held a deep appreciation for this podcast and what you try to do with it, or what you have done with it, to make it a little more serious, really.
I really love that. And part of why I thought you'd be the perfect co host is that you and I have had a great many discussions over the years about these different questions that we love and the stories we love and things like that. But we've never had a debate. It's always about here's my position, here's yours, how do they differ, how are they the same? And right now, I think so much of fandom is about debate. It's not about listening to other people and hearing their perspectives and having that inform yours. It's about how do I win? How do I get the best zinger? How do I get the best, one ups on this? And there's a lot of fandom that I think is great and I love. I'm not using this as an attack on fandom, and I certainly don't want to act like we're better and above it all by any means. We're fans. We are part of fandom. But I've really found that I think there is an audience, and to all you out there listening, I'm really glad you're part of it too, who wants to go a little deeper on these questions that I think a lot of times the creators really clearly want to. The stuff we're talking about is not invented things. There have been so many wonderful people who have over the years used these mediums of, I guess, genre fiction or things geeks love is the kind of terms I've used to encompass all of it. Because you're right, it is way off superheroes at this point. It's just sort of all those things that you mentioned and more. And they've always been, ever since you can go back to the first Captain America episode. You can go back to Mary Shelley writing what is considered Frankenstein, the first work of science fiction. You can go back, hundreds of years, even thousands of years probably. People use stories as ways to raise questions or perhaps suggest answers to those questions. And that's what I really want us to explore here more of. And, is looking at that. And so I'm just really excited that you're a part of this and that we're going to have that discussion together.
Yeah, another thing I come from, like, my background is as a sports fan, especially baseball, like, is so laden with statistics historically. And
Uh-huh.
it's very fascinating to be in baseball fandom and have discussions, whether it's like the current season, like who's the MVP, or more historical, like who is the greatest of all time, right?
Right.
And you bring up names like Babe Ruth versus Barry Bonds, who played it, almost 100 years apart and in very different eras under very different circumstances. But because of the continuity of statistics, you can have discussions, but no one is ever going to be right in those
Right.
discussions because you can't be. There's no actual way to tell who was quote unquote better at
Yeah.
baseball or who's the greatest. But it's fun to have those discussions, and that's the kind of thing I like to do, whether it's baseball or whether it's in fandom, is that it's not even like agree to disagree, but have fun disagreeing, because that's like the discussion is where we can have fun. And
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily have to be about changing minds, because I don't need to change someone's mind about whether I love a certain piece of media or fiction, right?
Yeah.
But if I express why I love it, maybe you'll gain a different appreciation. And even if you don't love it as much as I do, come to a certain understanding.
Yeah. I think it's such a great way to put it. And there's like, as often happens, there's like five different things I want to comment on, but let me just start with the baseball comment you made. First of all, today is the perfect day to say that because it is opening day for Major League Baseball, for most of Major League Baseball. Two teams started Major League Baseball a week and a half ago. Things are a little weird. My own New York Mets are starting tomorrow because of a rain delay. It's the only reason I'm available to record right now. But also, I am also a huge baseball fan. And one thing I have found really interesting in baseball, as you said, not only do we have these statistics over time, but over time, the way in which we look at statistics has changed a lot. And part of why it's hard to draw the comparisons that we do is that not only was the context, like, take like your Babe Ruth versus Barry Bonds discussion, not only is the context in which those two people played so different, but the stats by which we evaluate them. Many of you have heard me talk about Moneyball and how much, Billy Bean and the Oakland A's, and this whole idea of, him coming to a team and saying, baseball used to be measured by these statistics, but actually these statistics are a better way of looking at it. We should use those rubrics instead. And it meant reevaluating a lot of modern players and also reevaluating a lot of older players. The reason I'm saying all of that is because I think one of the things that we often do, and I really appreciate that I feel like really get the nuances of these conversations, is not only do we often analyze media right now, but we do look back on things from 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. And sometimes I think an interesting part of the conversation is to say, okay, well, there's lenses of analysis that we have today that we can use to evaluate these things, remembering that that's not the lens that people were writing through back then. But, and I think it's very easy to just say, oh, it was a different time, so they're completely forgiven. Or it's very easy to say that the time was so different that their time was bad and wrong, so everything from then is bad and wrong. And I think, one of the things we like to do here is to be able to say, yeah, we can acknowledge that the lenses we look at media through are not only different but are evolving and changing and different and will continue to be different. And I hold that all that complexity in mind when we look at media not just today but from a long time ago.
Yeah, especially right now. I mean, this is a topic that I put in the suggestions,
Uh-huh.
nostalgia media. So we'll
Yeah.
we'll probably in a future episode get to it more in depth. But I just want to touch on the fact that currently we have an ongoing series called X-Men 97 that
Mhm.
is based on slash possibly a continuation of a cartoon series from the 90s that ended in 1997. And a lot of those stories are based on comic book stories that were written in the 1980s. So we have
Right.
this like multi-generational legacy, and how like modern writers update the stories or change those stories is very interesting to me, and evaluating like what those stories mean to us today versus what they may have meant to audiences at the time that they
Yeah.
were originally released. Like that's I find that very fascinating, especially
Mhm.
as like comic books, Star Wars, Star Trek, we are getting into multi-generational content creation where the
Yeah.
people who are making the products now weren't alive, or maybe like were kids when these products were originally released, and they grew up as fans, and now they are getting to contribute to the continuation of that.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important discussion to have on two different levels. Because one level is what is the nostalgia of the creators and the society itself, but it's also what is nostalgia of us as viewers, because Batman starts in the 1930s as a comic. And so for many, I don't know if there's too many viewers who are, I don't know if there's too many listeners who were around long enough to have read that, but so I certainly salute you. But certainly, some of our older viewers probably started reading comics in the 50s or 60s or watched the Batman 66 show. I know for me, my introduction to Batman was that Batman 66 show, but really it was Michael Keaton. And so for me personally, my nostalgia of Batman starts in the mid 80s with Michael Keaton. And for someone else, it might start, like you said, with the X-Men. For someone else, their nostalgia of X-Men might start with, I almost said Patrick Swayze, Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, or it might start with the animated show, or it might start with the um, comic books or whatever it is. And so I think that's the nostalgia thing is such an interesting thing to look at. So, but putting it back on you for just a second, because I want our audience to get a little more about you. What was kind of your first what was kind of your first fandom? What was the first thing that you really started to kind of get into as a kid or whenever age?
100% Star Wars,
Yeah.
because I can't verify this, but I have been told by my parents that they took me to Empire Strikes Back in theaters when I was not really like a cognizant child.
Yeah.
So I take that as, at face value, that that was the first movie I went to in theaters. Certainly, Return of the Jedi was the first movie like I really remember owning the video cassette, the VHS of, and just playing it over and over again. I
Yep.
also had audio cassettes, kind of like summaries of those movies, and I
Oh,
listened
nice.
to those all the time. They basically like were like yeah, like short narratives of the
Mhm.
movies with some audio from the movies spliced in, I believe.
I
A
I
really
did listen to
weird
one of the
product of its time.
I didn't listen to any of the Star Wars ones, but I had one of Michael Jackson telling the E.T. story.
Yeah.
So I know exactly what you're talking about there.
And
Yeah, I
I
think
I
okay.
had some of, like the action figures, the toys, obviously like none preserved in the original packaging. So
Mhm.
I don't think I even own any of them anymore at this point. But that was definitely like my original fandom, and to this day is still one of my favorites. And then I would say that Japanese manga and anime really played a big part in my youth to teenage years.
Right.
Dragon Ball became really big when I was a kid, and I own all of the original books of
Mm.
that. And then through Dragon Ball, there were several other ones that I have followed over the years, including One Piece, which is still going,
Yep. And
over a thousand episodes.
we'll be talking a little bit about that in the bonus content at the end of this episode.
Yeah,
Well,
and
and just
then
to give people some more context for that, because I know you speak both English and Japanese quite well. If I can ask, um, which one did you kind of grow up speaking? And am I right that you were born in Japan but then came to this country? Or
yes, I'm a Japanese citizen, and I grew up speaking both languages.
Mhm.
Basically Japanese at home and English in public slash school. And
Mm.
I did also attend a Saturday Japanese school up until about high school, I believe.
Mhm.
So culturally, like I am very US, like Western based, because that's how I grew up. Like that's most of the media I consumed.
Mhm.
But I had enough, like I had grandparents in Japan who would send me things like video that they would record on VHS, like episodes of manga that they knew I liked.
Yep.
They sent me, like toys, video games, and all that stuff. So I have absorbed a lot of Japanese culture, but not necessarily directly, like as part of a Japanese audience.
Right. Because you
And
moved
then
here when you were fairly young.
yeah, and then seeing, I would say like what was it, Toonami
Mhm.
caused kind of like the first golden age of anime in the United States. when they aired episodes of Dragon Ball and other things. And then right now, I feel like we're in the silver age. Like with
Yeah,
streaming on Netflix, like I have caught up on so many anime that I kind of only knew tangentially and have gotten to watch them in Japanese also as well, because like Toonami would have been
yeah,
dubbed, right? So the ability to watch a lot of these shows in the original Japanese to me is very special and a fantastic opportunity for me to practice a little of my language as well, which has
for
gotten kind of
sure.
rusty.
Well, and I think it's something that's been so valuable to us on past episodes, obviously with anime, but also with things, everything from like Gojira to some of the other things we've seen, where I think it's, and I'm a big believer in kind of the postmodern idea of like that, wherever your social placement is, your experience of the movie, it's not right or wrong. It's just different from someone else's. But being able to give more of that background and history on things like the um Rorori Kenshin movies that we've seen together, or the Gojira movies, Godzilla movies, and stuff like that, has really been so invaluable.
Yeah, and the thing is like context matters, especially for anime, in
Right.
that you have to accept that certain tropes exist or certain like characters exist. And I think I've
Hmm.
mentioned this in the past. Japanese media, especially anime, often has like the one character who is a bit of a misogynistic pervert, right?
Right.
And these days, like in a Western media, you would never write a character like that. And we talked about how in the new Avatar, Sokka's misogyny was very toned down.
Right.
And I think we are starting to see that again. Like I'll mention One Piece, the character Sanji is much more of a womanizer, I would say, in the
Hmm.
original manga and anime. So we might be seeing a kind of blending and maybe smoothing out of traits like that, but still, like it exists. Like to this
Yeah.
day, like a lot of anime I watch, there's that one character where you're like, "Yep, that's the guy." Like
Hmm.
he's kind of treating women poorly.
Yeah. Well, and I think understanding those tropes is so fundamental, really, to all of media. And this question I come to from a particularly strange place, but I think it really fits. When I was in seminary and we were talking about the Hebrew Bible, my professor, really wanted us to better understand the context in which certain parts of the Bible were written, and actually same with Christian scriptures. And so one example that he used is he asked us, um, what war was the TV show MASH about? And we all kind of wrote something down, and he went through them, and the next day it said like that he could pretty clearly tell what age someone was by how they answered it, because most of the younger viewers said that the TV show MASH is about the Korean War, because that's what it
Mhm.
literally is about. But anybody who actually watched it at the time it was coming out knew very well it was 100% about the Vietnam War. It was, they used
Mm,
Korea as the metaphor, but if you understood it in the context of its time, they're talking about that. In the same way that like I don't think you can ever understand the first Gojira movie without understanding that it was made shortly after the American occupation of Japan left, only a couple of years after the nuclear bomb, things like that. And that's true for the understanding the X-Men, and how I think Stan Lee and um Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are writing in the 60s during civil rights, and then Christopher Columbus is that's not his name, is it? Um the
oh,
author
Chris Claremont.
Chris Claremont. Christopher
Yes.
Columbus is very different, obviously. Christopher Claremont, he's writing in the 80s, where I think if you don't understand all the debates about homosexuality and HIV AIDS and all that, it's very hard to you don't get the whole meaning. So, and I think that's something we're gonna really kind of look at is how do we both hold these shows in the context in which they're written, but also understand them in the context in which we experience them today? Because I think that is just as valuable. But
Yeah, and one
uh,
of the things that we talked about with your blessing, like I hope to add to this podcast is like deeper research
yep,
pieces on history, like on the history of what might have been happening in the real world, like when some older piece of media came out or was written, because I love that stuff. I'm a student of history, so like putting stuff into the context of what was happening or just like a deep dive like story about something is right up my alley.
yeah. No, I'm 100% here for that, and I think that's been I think sometimes people, especially because we go into the longer conversations about it, because I think it's very easy to say, to pull one fact out of history and say, oh, this is about that. And so therefore this is commenting on that. And therefore this means this and that kind of thing. And it's obviously much more complicated than that. And so I think it's interesting, actually. Here we are in the True Story family of podcasts. When I was one of the co-hosts of the Marvel Movie Minute, that was very much something we did. And so when we did Thor, we did a lot of research on the Norse, god ideas that so much, and the Norse mythology that so much of that was based on, as well as the Shakespearean references that were so often being made, and the all the other imagery and historical references that are being made by a superhero movie. So yeah, that is something I'm gonna be really excited about. But just let's talk about you a little more. So you started out a Star Wars fan, again, very much where I am. I think a couple of years older than you, but basically the same experience. Return of the Jedi is the first thing I remember seeing in theaters. I was told I went to see Empire. I don't remember a time where I hadn't watched A New Hope or Empire. But where did it go from there? You talked about manga. You talked about some other things. What was kind of the path for you?
Yeah, I mean, at some point, I got into Star Trek. I guess it would have been Next Generation.
Hmm.
I remember watching episodes of Star Trek, the original series, in syndication, but it was just like another one of those shows I watched, like of that era. Knight Rider is another one I
Hmm.
remember, which does not hold up at all. Let me tell you.
I'm not surprised.
Speaking of like terribly misogynistic characters, Michael Knight, yikes.
Mm.
I tried to watch it recently. I was like, no, no thanks.
Yep.
I'll just leave that in the nostalgia bin. But then yeah, like Star Trek Next Generation, I would say for teenage me was the most influential TV series
Mm.
of that time, of that era. As an adult fan now, I have a deeper appreciation for Deep Space Nine,
Yeah.
but at the time it was definitely TNG
Mm.
that kind of caught my imagination, and I watched every week. I bought books and I read about the production and about all the little things. And so to this day, like I can still probably name over 50% of Next Generation episodes just after like the first 5 minute teaser,
Oh wow.
pre
Yeah.
credits teaser. Yeah. So that's how deep of a fan I am. Like I am that like trivia nerd
Yeah.
when it comes to TNG, at least.
Well, and I know that TNG, all of Star Trek, really, my mother pointed this out, kind of going back all to the way to the original series, has always been very explicit about not just, crazy explosions and ship fights and fun aliens, but about really raising ethical questions in the kind of way that science fiction does at its best. I think Star Wars also has, but Star Trek's a lot more explicit. Do you think was there a certain age, or was it from the beginning that those particular questions, like that you kind of enjoyed talking to your friends about, like, oh yeah, what do you think should the captain have done this or that kind of thing?
And yeah, in terms of the superhero ethics of it all, I don't recall that being the case when I was a kid.
Hmm.
Of course, I recognized that Star Trek, what we would now call woke.
Yeah.
And but I don't know, like I think one of the beautiful things about what Star Trek does, like right from the original series, is that it just normalizes things.
Yeah.
I didn't even think too deeply about the fact, that the bridge crew of the original Enterprise had an Asian man, a Japanese man, Hikaru Suru, played by
Mm.
George Takei, or Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols, right? Like even growing up in the '90s, like I guess it was still a bit on the tokenized scale, but diversity existed in
Yeah.
in casts, especially of like science fiction shows. But it didn't really occur to me at the time when I was watching as a kid that was somehow revolutionary for the
Yeah.
time, and was like really ahead of its time. And it wasn't until definitely later that I read about things, like Nichelle Nichols' conversation with Dr. Martin Luther King,
Mm.
on why she wanted to quit the show after season one, and he was the one who convinced her to stay because of
Really?
how. Yeah, this is it's a famous story. You should look it up. Like her retelling of it is very beautiful,
Mm.
and she talked about how he was like, no, absolutely not. Like, do you know how important you are to have a
Yeah.
competent black woman on a national television show? And he was the one who convinced her to stay. And yeah, like, I don't, even she didn't realize like how important that role was. And that's the kind of thing, like, now as an adult, like, you can look back and see things like that, or see the way that media mismanages or misuses,
Yeah.
minority characters or actors, performers. And I think that it is deeply important,
Yeah.
because we have certainly come a long way as a society, and we have come a long way since the
Hmm.
1960s, even the 1990s. We're talking about next generation. I was just watching a video about, I believe the episode. See, now I think it's Code of Honor, the famous Next Generation episode where they go to a planet of all black people. That
Yep.
the depiction of them, but is very racist, right? And it's
Yeah,
like,
it's like the
even,
third I think it's the first episode after Farscape, or the second one. It's really bad.
and so, like, even in the 90s, that was happening. And it's like, either no one thought about it, or the people who did thought about it were not in a strong enough position of power to put a stop to it, and just kind of
Yeah.
like, okay, I guess we're doing this. And a lot of the people who participated in that production, whether it's the writers, the actors, most of them have, who speak about it, have come out and said that was bad,
Yeah.
shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
And so that's the other perspective I bring to myself, like, as a human being, and
Mhm.
just to everything that we're going to be talking about, is that we're never done. We should
Yeah.
never be done growing, learning, getting better. Like, even a show like Star Trek has made mistakes,
Yeah.
and it is our ability to learn from those mistakes and move forward and make the next thing we do better. And we'll still make mistakes, right? Like,
Yeah.
now we are in an era where television media is more comfortable telling stories about lgbtq lgbtq people, and yet those there will be mistakes, just because it's
Yeah.
not enough representation in the writers room or whatever. Like, people will make bad assumptions, etc. And that doesn't mean, like, we should stop trying. It means we
Yeah.
should try more.
And I think that's such a great way of looking at it, because you're right. It's easy to look back at some things and say, "Oh, it doesn't meet the standards of today, so therefore I don't wanna watch it." And sometimes I think that is the right thing to do, like, what you said about Knight Rider. Um, I still love the movie Ghostbusters because it still hits that nostalgic thing, but I wouldn't recommend it to someone today because it is incredibly misogynistic and has a lot of other problems. Um, really homophobic in way of portraying kind of one of the main villains is very effeminate and that kind of stuff. And but at the same time, I think we can also look at so there's that category, but there's also ways we can say, look, this was making steps intentionally to really improve on stuff that um had been done in the past, and here's some ways in which we succeeded, and here's some ways in which we today look at it and think, it's not great. And recently, Our Flag Means Death has been lauded as one of the best shows for queer representation out there. It is a very good show, I think, and I'm sure that in 30 or 40 years, people are going to look back on it and go, "Oh, this was wrong, and this was wrong, and this was wrong," and all these kind of analyses that you and I would never even dream of. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's where the really that is where the really interesting conversations can lie. Is how do we both look at it through the eyes of today, and also look at it through what was trying to be said back then. Because I also think that's important. Is that, yeah, the original Star Trek puts a far more diverse crew on screen than we've ever seen before. It still has the black woman as basically the, like, secretary, which is, commented a lot. Nichelle Nichols' role was revolutionary for the time. Looking back on it today, it's still a very, like, this is the best that they could do for a woman, especially a woman of color. But we can look at it from both sides. Captain Kirk was very open-handed and very, had some great attitudes and ideas. that were pretty progressive and revolutionary for his time. He's also not the greatest towards women, um, in a lot of ways. Um, so yeah, I'm just really excited to have all these conversations where it's not just about bash. I think you could hear this and think we're just kind of bashing on things. It's not that at all. It's much more about understanding things in their context, talking about how we see things today, and figuring out how do we each draw our own meaning from that.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that things aging poorly is a sign of progress.
Yeah.
Like if we look back on stuff from our lens today and say like this property has aged poorly, like these jokes have aged poorly, this character has aged poorly, that means we've made progress and come that much farther from where things were that day.
Yeah,
And
that's a great
it
point.
would be a very sad day for us if we looked back on something from 30 years ago and said, this still holds up like a-okay, perfectly fine, like everything is fine. No,
Yeah.
like I don't think there's any media that should hold up fine after 30 years. I think
Yeah, that's a good
a
point.
lot of them can hold up better, either because they were ahead of their time, or maybe because they don't touch upon as many things, you know, that will change over time, right? I think there are properties you can watch and read that hold up better just because they're a little more generic.
Hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that that is a there can be a very good way of writing things that way where they hold up over time. But like
Yep.
I think about the discussions about Lord of the Rings, for example,
Mm.
and the the racism of Tolkien. I think for his time, like Tolkien does appear to have been a very progressive person and progressive thinker. But even from that perspective, looking back at it from our today, like his progressivism was regressive in some ways.
Yeah. I think the total number of spoken lines by women in those books is like 3 pages, 4 pages, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the other part of the conversation, though, is also, and again, something being of its time doesn't excuse it, but I do think there's a big difference between someone who was like, all three of these analyses matter. Is how does it hold up compared to our current lens? How does it hold up compared to our lens looking at the time? And how does it hold up versus like the lens of that particular time? Because there are some things that were written that were seen as very racist even at the time they were written. Others that were pulling on tropes that were done by everyone at that time. And again, this kind of lets me get into another of the big themes that I think we're really going to be kind of trying to not that I think we've lost, but I think you're going to help us refocus on a little bit. When I say these things, I don't mean that we are going to be the declarative, here's the answer. Superman meant this. Batman should have done that. This piece of media is problematic. That this is not. That's not the point at all. Also in grad school, one of my favorite professors made the comment, and he's speaking here about religion, but I think it can be applied to anything, which is that um, it does its best when it raises hard questions. It does its worst when it offers easy answers to those questions. And for me and you listeners, I want you to really help hold us to this. I want our job to be asking questions in new ways, asking questions that can help people think about things in new ways, or just acknowledging the questions that the creators that we're talking about are raising through their works. And in times it'll be we each have our thoughts on what the answer should be, or sometimes the creator, like I think there are some times where a Star Trek episode leaves it pretty open in terms of what you think should or shouldn't happen. I think there are other times where, like with one of the my favorite episodes, Measure of a Man, where they raise very interesting questions about androids, but I think the show comes down pretty hard on the idea that Data should have rights over his own existence. Um, and I think both of those can be good. But the point is always, I think, more than anything, I want people to walk away with more questions that they're thinking about, rather than just saying, "Oh, well, Matthew and Riki said this, so that's the answer," or much more likely, Matthew and Riki say this, so the answer must be something else.
Yeah, I think one of the things I suggested is we try to have like an opening question
Yeah.
to our discussions in the future, like not just say we're going to talk about like X-Men 97, but have like X-Men 97 brings up this question about whatever,
Yeah.
and then go from there. And that can inform our discussion. But I hope also invite listeners to write in with their answers or write in with their follow-up questions or
Yeah,
other questions that they thought up.
definitely.
Because I agree, like it's really boring to just like listen to something like a podcast and just have people tell you how it is and then you're done. I prefer it when I listen to a podcast and I go, well, okay, let me like go do some of my own research now and like try to figure out what I think about
Yeah.
this. Like it's always a good starting point, especially if it's like a well researched piece. Like I said, I want to try to do that more. It's like put a little bit more research like into the history of things because I love that. But then just like open more doors
Yeah.
for listeners and for us too. Matthew, you and I have a history of just talking way too long about things.
Yep.
So I'm sure that will continue. But I look forward to that. And I look forward to I just have like one more thought. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
we don't have time for that now, but maybe like in the future and we can like have two-parters or something like that. Right.
Yeah, I think we might start having regular feedback episodes, and some of the feedback episodes might just be like, oh, here's the one more thing that each one of us thought about.
Yeah.
I think that could be.
Feedback to ourselves.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I will say we've gotten great listener feedback. We got some great ones during the Avatar show. We've gotten some more from that. We're going to do that more, and we're going to definitely be reading your feedback in these episodes, both after it comes out, but also as Riki said, sometimes beforehand, where we'd like to say like, hey, look, this piece of media is coming up, and here, or it might be a media from 10 years ago, but here's an interesting question we're going to look at. And that was something we did a lot in the earlier years of this podcast. It's funny, I was thinking that one of the lenses of analysis I do sometimes look at media through, and I was wondering if I should bring this up, but now I think I should bring it up because I think I've been guilty of it too. Obviously, this media costs an incredible amount of money to produce. And there are definitely times when the struggle between the creative team and the people who are paying for the creative team is a struggle. And there are compromises that have to be made. And like when you brought up that episode, I wonder to what extent if that was part of that. Um, and I think that there have definitely been times when creative decisions are made out of a fear or concern over what audiences will want to see or what not to see. Um, on the episode that actually came out just before this, my guests were talking about how for the longest time people thought you couldn't put a black man as your main hero for a superhero movie on a poster, and that's why Black Panther, it took so long to get it made. Let alone that Blade had been made decades ago, but still, same with Shang-Chi, and um, but I bring all that up to say I think that that's a very real concern. I think it's overly idealistic to say so everything should just be completely for creative because these things do cost money, and I understand that, but I wish that the creative was driving it a lot more. But I'll also say I think part of why this podcast started to focus more on covering media exactly when it came out and therefore doing more of the kind of broad reach instead of a specific question is because the week or really the 3 days after a new piece of media comes out is when the most people are searching for it. And so it's the way to get our podcasts to get the most hits and get the most listens and increase our audience. And I think that was a big part of what was driving me. And there's still going to be some of that. I do think it's great to be part of the conversation right when it's relevant. But I do think we're going to kind of take a step back from that a little bit and really be able to look a little bit more at, there are 8 million people telling you how good or how bad the new Ghostbusters movie is. And we haven't done coverage on that yet. I'm going to do a Ghostbusters episode at some point soon, but it's probably going to be much more looking at a specific question. Quite likely that might be the time to talk about nostalgia. I haven't seen the movie yet, so I can't tell you for sure. But I think that's what we're going to really try to be going for a lot more is how do we look at this through that little bit deeper lens? Or not even deeper, that sounds pejorative to others. But just how can we look at it through a somewhat different lens than what a lot of is out there?
It's funny. I was gonna bring up Ghostbusters
Hmm.
because I was looking at the box office numbers,
Uh-huh.
and basically the new one, Frozen Empire, has matched Afterlife in kind of like its opening weekend box office numbers,
Mhm.
and then comparing that to the, is it just called Ghostbusters, the all female cast
Right.
one?
Yeah, I think it's just called Ghostbusters.
I think that one actually made more money overall than Afterlife, and is on track to have made more money than Frozen Empire, like if the trends hold up.
Mhm.
But that one cost a lot more to make. Like, and if you watched it, you can tell like they went a little ham with the special effects of all the ghosts, right?
Mhm.
And so yeah, like when it comes to these studios putting out media, money has to be a concern.
Yeah.
And the success of something, you have to look at it through the lens of both the money it brings in, but also the cost.
Right.
And
And I think unfortunately, from the studio's perspective, that cost is measured not only in the actual cost in terms of money was spent on the movie itself, but also in the negative press it gets. And I think it's something we've I'm not gonna I think at one point we were trying to get into responding to a lot of the trolling arguments. We're probably not gonna do that much, but we'll definitely talk about it because I do think that the there was a public perception that everybody hated that movie. Clearly they didn't. It made a lot of money and a lot of people loved that movie. But as often happens, the people who went online and talked about it and who were most often, retweeted and resent around were the people who were saying, "Oh my God, get these girls out of my Ghostbusters. This is so, silly and bad and all this kind of stuff."
yeah, but here's the point I want to make is that I agree that all that happened,
Uh-huh.
and it's possible that it has had a role in some opinions and decisions. But the cost, like the cost of production, is like I think it was like double of what Afterlife cost.
Right.
And again, like if you watch both movies, you can tell based on like how they use the special effects and the scenes that they set up, like the set piece towards the end of the Ghostbusters with the dance number. I don't know
Mhm.
if you recall that one, is a really big scene, like in terms of all the extras and the special effects, because like ghosts are dancing as well.
Right.
And I think from the studio perspective, like that had to have been a concern. It's like the overall
Yeah.
cost, and then like the little decisions that led to it costing so much.
Mhm.
So yeah, like do execs like read Reddit? Maybe, but overall, I would think like the money issue was a bigger thing
Well,
in
but I
terms
mean,
of what that franchise has done.
I think if that's true, like I do think you're right. The money is definitely a big part of it, but you know, Kate McKinnon, Christine Wiig, Leslie Jones, these people aren't, demanding huge salaries. And I don't know why you couldn't have just made a sequel in that universe with, a much more reduced budget in terms of special effects and things like that. Like, I definitely hear you. And I think a lot of people, probably myself included, overblow the effect of online trolling. But the Snyder Cut was re-released. The Snyder Cut was, or no, sorry, not the Snyder Cut. What's the other? Yeah, no, the Snyder Cut. The Snyder Cut was released. The Star Wars movies were changed. I think we have it on record in part because of a lot of the fan pushback. So you're right. We're not in the boardrooms. We have no way to know, and it's entirely possible that it is much more about the money. Um, but I do think that the trolling has more of an effect than I think you're coming from. But you're probably also right. The money is much more too.
Yeah, I mean, we barring insider information, like we don't know why certain people aren't brought back for
Yeah.
things. But I think it's notable, like you're talking about the actresses in that
Hmm.
Ghostbusters movie, but the whole production team changed, right? Like that
But
Ghostbusters movie was hemmed by like Paul Feig,
hmm. Both.
and and they and for Afterlife they brought in Reitman. I can't remember
Right.
his first name, but the son of the original director.
Right. Son of Ivan Reitman.
Yeah,
Well, but I'm just saying, it's not unheard of by any means to keep the same cast, keep the same canon, but bring in a completely new set of production.
I that's a I don't know. That's like a big topic, like
Yeah.
in terms of franchises and stuff. Like I pay attention like to a lot of horror media, and right now Scream has gone through a lot of drama. So
Mhm.
it yeah, I don't have an answer
Yeah. This would be a
because
great topic for us to research and dive into.
yeah.
Well, and so with that, what are some of the other topics that you want to either other questions you want us to explore or other forms of media that you want us to dive into more, either in particular stories or medium?
I mean, I just brought it up, but horror I think is something. Have you ever touched upon the horror franchises at all?
Not too much. Over on Stranded Panda, the podcast network that I'm still very fond of, Bill and Ashley's Terror Theater does great coverage on that kind of stuff. We've had them on as guests once or twice, but I've always wanted to explore that more, especially because, from my understanding at least, as far back as the 50s, because horror was seen as so irrelevant, a lot of the most like critical of the McCarthy era type stuff was happening in horror, in part because it was the one piece of media that the McCarthyites and the rest of them weren't even looking at. So yeah, I think I can go all the way to Jordan Peele today with everything thrown in there. So yeah, horror is a genre I would definitely love to look at further.
Yeah, I think we should because I mean, you said going back to the 50s. I would say like 50s era horror was mixed in more with science fiction, right? With like kind of
Right.
the monster era, like is it them, the giant ants, like a lot of radioactive themed
Yep.
monsters, not just Godzilla. And more modern, like it's fascinating. I think modern slasher horror,
Mm-hmm.
if you think about it, it's just like blood and gore and like people killing people or supernatural things killing people. Like it's so much deeper than that. Like Texas
Yeah.
Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, like these franchises have so much going on in terms of social commentary at the time that is still very relevant.
Yeah.
And I think like exploring those questions is important because and it's not just what the people are doing, but it's the people who are doing it.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at not just actors who got their start in horror, but directors, right?
Mm.
The actual people making movies who got their start in horror these days, like James Gunn,
Yep.
Guillermo del Toro. Um, I think maybe kind of Robert Rodriguez. Like these
Mm-hmm.
people have very deep roots in horror, so it's also like this breeding ground of talent. I
Yeah.
think because like you can kind of get into it on the cheap side, so to speak, and
Mm-hmm.
practice in a setting that is like free from a lot of prying eyes in
Yeah.
terms of media criticism and all that, and just like hone your talent there.
I think that's true, and I think that even just the lines of what is horror, what is science fiction versus like the Godzilla movies that we love to talk about. Like, is that monster horror? I think some of them definitely are. A lot of them aren't, but they certainly have well. Some of the ones are just kind of fun people in rubber suits fighting each other, but a lot of them have a ton of social commentary. And you can even go back much further. I mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as the first science fiction novel. I think you can also describe it as one of, if not the first, horror novels in the same kind of way. Um, yeah. Um, and to me, there's so much to talk about there, both because often there's commentary that the directors are making, but also because a lot of times there's commentary that they're not trying to make, or maybe they are, but we can definitely see. Because certainly, I think if you watched the slasher movies I grew up on, the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Streets, um, one of the first moral lessons you learn is that if you're a teenager who has sex, you deserve to die. Because that's what every one of those movies shows. And there's always that sort of, sex negative that like they play on the sexiness to get people there, but also they always kill the people who have sex. And it's often the whole last girl syndrome. So yeah, there's tons there we could talk about. Talk more about anime and manga. 'Cause I know that's another area that you want us to explore some more.
Yeah, well, I mentioned that we are in what I would call like a silver age. Like they don't have names, right? But we apply these terms to them. But it anime right now, like the ability to watch anime has never been easier,
Mhm.
and I have enjoyed that a lot. And I know like a lot of people out there have been enjoying it.
Yeah.
And it's also weird that we're getting into this era of uh, adaptations, which has been going on in Japan for quite some time,
Mm.
and they're about as equally bad as most of the ones we are getting in English. So, but what I want to say about that is that I had lunch with a friend today, and we like to talk about TV, and I asked about Avatar, like, hey, have you seen Avatar? It's like, yeah, we watched the live action one, and now we just started season one of the animated Avatar
Mm.
series. I said, oh, that's good because I think that one's better. So, in the past on our Avatar coverage, we mentioned who is this for, right? And one of the points was, well, it's for people who maybe didn't necessarily watch the animated show, and
Yeah.
it gives them an entry point into the
Mhm.
fandom. So there was an example of that. My friend, because they watched the new live action one, have now got into the animated one. I hope he enjoys it. I hope
Mhm.
he likes it. But that's the thing. And so, it comes back to what you said earlier about money.
Yeah.
If it if it makes the studio money and kind of prolongs the franchise, I guess,
Yeah.
then we'll continue to get things like this, because that's ultimately for the studios what it's about, right? Like if you have a property that is successful, Avatar: The Last Airbender, you don't want it to just end. Like
Yeah.
nothing. That's the other thing about fandom now, is that nothing ever ends. No one
Right.
ever dies. No character ever dies. Nothing ever ends, and the saga must always have a to be continued in. You know, Captain America will appear next in this movie, as
Right.
as we always get at the end of the MCU movie, right? Because that is the perpetual moneymaker. Is once you hit upon a formula or a set of characters or a world that people like, you they I say you like they got to keep
Yeah.
milking that. Which,
Yeah.
if we like these worlds, good, I think, for the most part. Sometimes it's disappointing,
Mhm.
and we'll certainly talk about that, about like
Yeah.
the balance of being excited that there's another Star Wars series versus the disappointment that maybe that Star Wars series isn't as good
Yeah.
as past ones.
I think it's really true. Uh,
But we're
what
getting more Star Wars. Like you and I
Yeah.
have both lived through eras where it was like decades
Oh,
between
yeah.
like a movie.
I really thought I was done with Star Wars after the prequels,
Yeah,
because,
and we've read the
um
books. Like
yeah.
I read so many of those books because I just wanted more stories with Luke, Han, Leia, Lando, etc.
Yeah. And I will say, just going back to what you're saying before about anime, um, one of the reasons why it's a lot easier to watch, especially here in the United States or in other countries, is that there is a lot more of it streaming, and a lot of people can watch it dubbed, which is great. And what I'm about to say may well be heresy, but I think also another way that it's easier for some of us, particularly those of us with ADHD or things like that, to watch, is that studios are now putting a lot more money and hiring much better translators and writers and actors for dubs. Because I am someone for whom, with my ADHD and other neurodivergence, sitting and staring at a screen so that I can read everything is very difficult for me. I'm able to do it, and definitely there's a lot of things that make it worthwhile. But especially for a show, it's really hard for me to sustain. And something I want to keep getting better at, and I'm teaching myself to get better and better at watching stuff that isn't dubbed and just reading the subtitles. But there's a lot of great pieces that Full Metal Alchemist, which I really want to talk to you about when you get a chance to watch some of it. I watched that because of it was dubbed into English, and the English actors and translator the writing was fantastic in a way that so often it isn't. So it's just one more part, and I'm sure that's the conversation we'll have, is because I am absolutely sure that there are elements of the original that I'm completely missing. And even with what was the first movie? I think it was the Rurouni Kenshin movie, the first Kenshin movie we brought on, where you talked about how the translation that Paul and I had gotten was wrong because it's it was the word not to not cut versus to not kill. But I also think that like when you can make things 80% accessible to a group who are never going to be able to experience it as 100% accessible, that's still a step forward.
Yeah, I mean, in general, when people get on their high horses about sub versus dub,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's there's no right answer to it.
Yeah.
I obviously I prefer watching in or listening in Japanese, and I often have it with the English subtitles because
Mm-hmm.
that's just how the television works. But also, like if Sarah is there with me, my
Yeah.
wife, and I notice because I'm like listening and reading, and I notice when the translations are, I'll just say like wonky. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like this is something I've been thinking about a lot with translation is that you can't just do like a word for word transliteration
Right.
because dialogue and conversation is often about feeling. I
Yeah.
was watching a show, Yu Yu Hakusho, the live action one, which is I highly do not recommend. I'm a huge fan of the original manga, and I was thinking about catching up and watching the anime version, but this live action one takes like three separate storylines, like three separate arcs, and condenses it into 4 episodes of a TV
Right.
show. I was like, what have you done? But my point was there was an interesting scene in it where two characters are in a hospital with one of the characters' mother, and she starts coughing because she's in the hospital because she's sick, and the son character says "okasan, okasan," which is just mother. He says mother twice, but the subtitle says like "Are you okay?"
Right.
Right, instead of just mother, because like the context is that he's concerned for his mother, and I
Yeah.
think that comes through in the acting, the way that the character intonates saying "okasan," but if you don't know what he's saying, then it doesn't matter like how he's saying it. So you have to translate that into like what he means.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that's why like I'm okay. I'm coming around to being okay with like however you want to consume it. And I don't know like sub versus. I think sometimes like sub and dub actually uses different translations even maybe because
Mm,
maybe a dub of that scene, the character in English would just say mother, like, and you would maybe get what he means through
right.
the way he's saying it.
Right. That you wouldn't get if you're just reading the written word.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true. And it's interesting you went there because where I often think it becomes most important is with idioms, where
Oh
there's just
yeah,
a
yeah.
phrase that like, we say like, oh yeah, that really takes the cake. If you translate that into some other language, people
Uh
probably gonna have
huh.
no idea. But there's probably I imagine most languages have a similar idiom that means something similar, or at least a similar phrase. Um, and I will say that's one other thing. I wish the strike had been settled far sooner. I wish that I'm glad the union got a lot of things they wanted. I wish they gotten even more. But I will say that one silver lining, at least for me, and I think I heard this from a lot of you fans and creators, is that during the strike, a lot of us were given a good push to look outside the traditional American media system and the big Hollywood studios. And I definitely want us to do a lot more things that are not created in the United States. And a lot of that will be Japan, both because I think that Japanese media is probably the second most influential to English speaking geeks after, American or British, but also, but also because of your skills and knowledge and experience. But there's also great stuff being made all around the world. And I'm looking forward to seeing, like stuff from Italy, France, China, Africa, that we can talk about and look into and there do some of the research. And also I think it'll be very important that Riki is my co-host, but just as happened when Paul is the co-host or Jacob's the co-host, we're often probably gonna have a third person. It's a lot easier to have a co-host than try and recruit a guest for every week. But I'm hoping at least 1 or 2 episodes a month, we'll probably have a third person in here. Often just because it's a great person who has other good opinions, but also because sometimes it'll be someone who represents a different perspective than either of the two of us can. Riki and I are very different, but we're both masculine presenting. We're both, geeks of a certain generation. Um, there's some ways in which there's never a way we can get every voice onto the podcast. And certainly I don't want any person to feel like you're here to be my black guest or my gay guest or whatever it is. But I just think that there's a lot of perspectives you and I have that are going to be great, but also having more guests is just always going to add to the conversation.
Yeah, I always appreciate when you have me on to talk about something like anime based or Japan based. And
Mhm.
I know like you're not doing it just because I'm Japanese.
Yeah,
Like it's because we always have good conversations. But I am happy to provide what lived experiences or like research I've done because I can like do research in both languages and try to find out stuff about things. And I think it's important to consider all perspectives on
yeah,
things. And it doesn't mean that people are there just because they like it's complicated. Like they're not just there because of who they are or like that, that's what they bring. But
yeah,
you have to listen. You have
yeah,
to listen to other people, right? So at some point you have to have them on. I think the key difference is you shouldn't just have people on those episodes,
yeah,
right? Like I have been on to talk about, like say Green Lantern, Sinestro, which has nothing to do with being Japanese, for
yeah. That
example.
was the first.
So
I remember that was the first thing I think we brought you on for.
yeah. Um, so that I think that's the important thing of like not tokenizing people is don't just engage with them on the topic of like whatever their
Yeah,
identity is. I just use like big air quote parentheses
yeah.
for you
No,
listeners.
I think it's very true, and I'll also say for listeners, if you have ideas of other people we should have on as guests, definitely please let us know. Either yourself or I'm sure everyone out there has great opinions. I would like someone who has some content out there already that I can listen to, or has some background or something like that. But if you think you'd make a good guest, or if you think that you know another creator and you want to send me their Twitter account or their TikTok or their podcast or anything like that, let me know. Because yeah, I think part of Riki, why you are someone who I know I could reach out to because you and I had formed a connection in other ways. And there are people who I have now, built contacts with. Jessica Plummer is someone who I've become very good friends with. I've had her on for a whole range of topics. And sometimes when there is something about feminism in the superhero world, she's the first person I look to. But I know there's others. And I'm always trying to expand that pool. The pool is still a lot more narrow than I would want it to be right now. And so, listeners, you got thoughts and ideas, definitely please let us know. Well, Riki, this has been a great conversation. There's a lot more we can say. And we're going to have a special bonus episode for the members on giving you just a little taste of our opinions on the One Piece live action. We will be
Oh
doing a full
boy.
episode about that later, but we have a lot of things to say already. And of course, if you don't have access to that, you can become a member for only $5 a month, $55 a year. With Riki now on board as a co-host, I'm going to start making bonus full episodes we do on the Star Wars podcast just for members. As a member, you're a member of the Ethical Panda, which is both of these podcasts, so you get access to both of those. But if you just want superhero ethics, you can just listen to those. That's just fine too. So, Riki, if you have any last questions or thoughts or piece of media or something like that you wanted to raise that you're looking forward to exploring?
Um, I think I just want to reiterate like horror is amazing.
Yeah.
And especially when you're talking about like the international media,
Hmm.
I like the number of horror things that I watch from other countries, whether it's like these days, there's a lot of great Korean horror, a lot of Spanish language stuff I've been watching,
Hmm.
Italian as well. Obviously, like Italian, Suspiria is one of the all time classics. That I think is a genre that really it is deeply international. And
Hmm.
because of the way horror is structured, like the things that scare people is different, right? Like
Yeah.
culturally, like the folk tales and the legends people tell. And that to me is what makes horror so deep, is like seeing another culture's boogeyman, so to speak,
Yeah.
is very fascinating to me.
And I think that becomes really interesting, both looking like internationally, but also looking chronologically. There's a great thing I read a while ago that was basically about how I think this lined up to around Generation X, millennial, but the years they were looking at might have been a little bit off from that. But it was basically saying how at one point the cultural obsession was with vampires, and then it became the cultural obsession was with zombies. And like, what was that
Mm,
about? And what
yeah,
was the
yeah.
cultural reasoning for that? And I think that that's the they made some really good points about that. And Professor Matthew Capel also has some great theories about that in terms of vampires more being elitist and zombies being much more populist, and where does those different fears come from and things like that. The fear of the elites versus the fear of the unthinking mass. Uh, and I think that's another great analysis to look at. So, yeah, it's. And I think that's more of the kind of thing we can look at is like read some of these articles, do more of that research to go a lot deeper.
Clowns. Like I read a research piece basically that says our obsession with like scary clowns is rooted in the real life serial killer John Wayne Gacy,
Mm,
because he often dressed up as a clown, I believe, to lure victims or something like that, or that was his day job. I don't remember that part of it, but like that's what he is famous for, and that's like when clowns in media started to get scary, like it,
hmm
Stephen King's It.
You may well be onto something. I will say until this moment, I didn't know that John Wayne Gacy dressed up as a clown. I do know that a clown shot water in my face when I was 5 years old at the circus, and I've hated them ever since. But it may well be. So who knows? To any clowns out there in the audience, I apologize. It just happened to me. Who knows? Um, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to these conversations. We're gonna have a great time. We're bringing this episode in under 70 minutes, which is going to be my goal for our main episodes, and try to be 1 hour and a half for the total episode with bonus content, hopefully lower. When Paul gets on here, all bets are off because the three of us are by far, with Jessica Plummer coming in fourth, the most long-winded speakers on this podcast, but hopefully we'll have a lot to say. So, Riki, thank you so much. To our listeners, thank you so much. To our members, you're awesome. You're what's helping make all this happen. You're why I can people can see me on the video again because I have a new computer. I still have a lot of it to take care of, but more membership is great. But to those who are members, thank you so much. Your bonus content is coming in just a moment. For everybody else, thank you so much. We have spoken.
Yub, no, I don't know. I need a sign off.
There you go. All right, for our members, welcome back. Thank you so much as always. So, Riki, before you even touch the live action, talk to me about your first experiences of One Piece. Because if I understand correctly, you got into it not even with the anime, but with the manga, correct?
Yeah, I mean,
And what is manga for those of our audience who don't know that term?
well, manga is just comic books in Japan.
Right.
That's just, I think it's just a word for like drawn characters or something like that. But in Japan, so in the United States, comic books come out once a month. Is that
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah, yeah. And so you get 12 issues a year. In Japan, a lot of this media comes out weekly.
Mm,
So like One Piece or Dragon Ball, you would get 52 episodes a year. And then those are condensed into the novels, like the books. And those have, I don't know how many they have, maybe like 10 episodes in each book or something like that. So usually like every year you get one or two of the books as well.
mm-hmm.
Basically like the equivalent of our graphic novels here. And One Piece in particular is published in a franchise called Shonen Jump, which just
Mm,
is like shonen is the Japanese word for young boy, young man, and then the jump is just the brand. So it's like clearly like it's for young boys, but people of all generations and all gender do read the Shonen Jump, but its primary audience is young boys.
right.
And this was the magazine that like Dragon Ball was published in as well. So I was very familiar with it. And just one week, it was actually like before the series started, there was like a preview or a one shot they
Mm,
would often have like one shots from new authors, kind of like testing out the market or testing out their art style and whatnot. So I remember I think it was called Romance Dawn, which I believe is also the name of the first episode of the actual manga run. And it was just like a one shot of this goofy pirate kid who has gummy abilities because he ate a magical fruit. And it's kind of a quirky uh, pre-industrial, right? Like pre-industrial fantasy world. Like it's clearly not Earth, but it has like a lot of Earth, like 1700s ish
mm-hmm.
technology and like the pirate era of our real history. It's just a fun universe.
Yeah.
And it was from the beginning, and now is I think it's like the second longest ongoing franchise in history. Maybe the first at this point, but it
Mm,
has obviously become like this worldwide phenomenon. And now like I think the live action adaptation is the best live action adaptation of an anime I've ever watched. And it was
yeah.
phenomenal. I'm looking forward to more of it. And it's just I don't know. Like since Dragon Ball, it is definitely the manga series that I collected the most books of. I mean, I actually probably have more books because it's gone on longer,
Mm,
but it was the one that I tried to keep up with, and I stopped because it just kept going and going. But I have like, I don't know, like 40 of the books, I think.
yeah. No, that's great. And I I think one of the reasons why it's so interesting to talk about One Piece is because I had the exact opposite experience. I went into it knowing almost nothing about it. The only thing really that I knew was that a lot of people I there's some anime I've really enjoyed, but for the most part, it's not really a genre that I have no critique of it. I think it's fantastic. It's not really one that speaks to me. Um, and a lot of people have said, like, look, if you ever really wanted to watch an anime that is the closest you can get in an English language live action show to the spirit of this particular kind of anime, this is it. And I think it's awesome they were really able to capture that so well.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day because there was a terrible Dragon Ball live action movie called Dragon Ball Evolution. And
Hmm.
first off, like they completely changed pretty much everything about it, which was weird. But also, like you can't make Dragon Ball live action. Like we were talking in the main episode about cost, and there's just like no point in spending the CGI budget to do what they do in Dragon Ball if you can just
Hmm.
do it in animation because it'll
Yeah.
be much cheaper and it'll be much cleaner. Like the speed of the characters and the combat in Dragon Ball doesn't translate to live action at all
Yeah.
because it looks goofy. I think of like Legolas doing the Oliphant surfing in Return of the
Hmm.
King. Like it like the CGI was not there yet, but it's also like the action looks goofy, like
Yeah.
for a quote unquote real person to be doing that.
I mean, I think if you want to watch a lot of the earlier comic book movies, even out to like I think almost all of the 20th century, translating that stuff to live action was really hard to do. And a lot of time the fight scenes look ridiculous.
Yeah. And even now, like that's probably one of the weaker aspects of One Piece is like when he uses his Gomu Gomu ability, it looks goofy. I think the CGI is more believable than it has been in the past, and it's okay. Like it passes like the smell test of like it doesn't necessarily look like CGI, but it's also a little goofy that you are having like a real life person like punch someone in this way. So
I
that is a thing that I have to concede is
Mhm.
like not translating the greatest, but I also think it's actually the least important thing about One Piece.
I mean, I have to say, and this is again probably where I think it was a very interesting show and raised interesting questions. It's just very much not what I enjoy. To me, the goofiness wasn't the punch, wasn't the animation of the punch. It's him saying like whatever really ridiculous catchphrase he says with every punch. that just made me go like, this kid's just annoying. And again, that's just me, but like, I wonder is that like, I'm trying to better understand this because it feels like the whole rest of the show is so intentionally goofy that wouldn't you want the fight scenes to look just as goofy as the rest of the show is, or is it just that I see it as goofy when it really isn't?
Well, I mean, you're talking about him calling out his moves, right?
Yeah,
Like his primary move is, I believe, Gomu Gomu Pistol,
right.
Gum Gum Pistol, when he just like throws his gummy arm like way back and then punches it forward. And again, like that's just anime. Like
Yeah.
when they make that joke about like all great fighters call out their moves, that was a very tongue-in-cheek meta joke in the story, but
Mm-hmm.
also about the whole industry. Like in Dragon Ball, the most famous move is Kamehameha, which is Goku's like big energy blast. And you have to have that. Like Bleach is another property where they have these giant swords and they all have moves that they call out when they do their maneuvers. And the reason is because you want audiences to recognize, right?
Right.
Like I don't, do you watch professional wrestling like WWE and all that?
I've seen a little bit of the modern era. I certainly grew up watching it on the WWF era, but yes, I've seen some of it. I know, yeah, they all have signature moves, and
Right. And the wrestlers themselves aren't going to call them out because they're not mic'd up. Like you can't hear them. But that's what the commentators are for, right? Like the
right,
commentator is there to narrate the action for one and like bring some drama and excitement, but also to like explain things. And then in that key moment to say like the rock's going for the rock bottom or the people's elbow and to name the move so that the
yeah,
fans know what it is and can get excited about it. And I think that to me is like the same idea is that when Luffy does the Gomu Gomu Pistol, like that's a big thing, at least early on. Like that's his big
mhm,
move. And like he's going for it. Like this is his finisher right now. And he's gonna knock out the opponent. And then in like that gives you context of in a future fight, if he does the Gomu Gomu Pistol and it doesn't work or it doesn't knock out the opponent, you're like, okay, now we have moved up a step in the battle
mm,
where this opponent is stronger. So he needs a different move. So he'll do something else. He'll develop a new technique. And like the same thing pretty much happens in all this combat anime is that there there's like these level up moments. And I think that's part of the reason you have to name the moves is that the audience has to recognize that the move is special, that it's
mhm,
worth naming beyond just like punching real hard, and B, like when the signature move of the past doesn't work anymore, then now it's time for a training montage or just like an in-fight level up moment where he comes up with a new technique.
mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, it, I don't know if it's because I didn't grow up doing it or because I'm not a big fan of fight scenes. Everything you say makes perfectly logical sense if you start from the first principle, which is one I just can't kind of board with. But
Well,
uh,
you said
but
like
but I think, well, let me just say, I think that's one of the thing about this podcast I want to really acknowledge is it's okay if not every piece of media is for everyone. And there's a lot of anime that surprised me, and I think One Piece raised some great questions that I'm really looking forward to talking to you about, and I think that we can do that even with stuff that isn't to our own personal taste of entertainment.
I don't know if you said it intentionally, but I'm
Uh-huh.
pretty sure you just said that you didn't grow up doing this rather than like watching, and that is like a key to me is that I
Mm,
grew up like I said with Dragon Ball, and if you are a kid of a certain era or maybe even like an adult of a certain era, if you didn't like in the playground just like go to your friend and go kamehameha and like throw your energy ball at your fake energy ball at them, like that we all did that as kids. And that's what I think too is like we talked about the audience is that this is
yeah,
shonen jump. This is like young boy jump. And
yeah,
and like that thing of playing, like I don't know, like for I think wrestling is the closer analogy because like super superhero like DC and Marvel superheroes
I
don't
mean,
do anything, right?
I don't think they often have signature moves, but they often
Yeah,
have like lines.
like
Like the
catchphrases.
yeah, like the you know, Ben Grimm, in Fantastic Four, it's clobbering time,
There you go. There you
you
go.
know?
Okay.
And yeah, I think kids definitely on the playground definitely ran around saying those things. I was in a corner reading a book because I was autistic as hell. So yeah, it made me just like I didn't do those things growing up. Um,
So that's what, yeah, like it's clobbering time is a good one. Like Hulk
yeah,
Smash
yeah,
is another good one, right? So that, I mean, I think it's the calling out of the move, like, is kind of a melding of that, like the catchphrase and the wrestling signature move.
right. I mean, certainly the point you made about how easily you can show that this enemy is much worse than the others by having the signature move not do what we expect it to do. I mean, I immediately thought of a similar moment in Marvel, which is when Thor throws his hammer and Hela catches it and crushes it. Because we have
Yeah.
seen that hammer destroy every enemy, along the way. And Thor doesn't have a single catchphrase, but he almost always says something ridiculous while he throws his hammer, and it always works. And it's because it always worked that, yeah, when we saw her crush it, we knew everything that scene meant, that had been built up by these years and years of seeing him do this thing with a hammer. So, yeah, no, I totally get it. It's just the goofy line itself. Um, but that's, I think, just more that we'll get into this when we talk about One Piece itself, because I think there are elements of that character represents a genre of the like super exuberant, super hopeful. I'm living in a bit of a fantasy world, but I'm just going to drag everybody else into it instead of acknowledging the reality of the world everyone else lives in. Um, and I mean that like metaphorically, not in terms of like an actual different world. That's just never been my favorite kind of character, and that's fine. That's totally okay.
I so I'm laughing because the thing that is currently like right now, March 2024, what the character Luffy is doing, I believe, is like literally rewriting reality. Like that's where that property has finally reached, like in terms of power level.
Uh huh.
So it's funny that you said it that way
Yeah, the
because
metaphorical has become literal. I like it.
yeah, but it's also like if you can believe it, like this is what the writer was looking at all along, right? Because I agree what you said about the character. Like he is very much an anime trope of
Yeah.
a super optimistic protagonist character. But I think what has always made One Piece special is that optimism is like far beyond any other similar characters, any other similar protagonist. And if we can believe that he meant this all along, that he can literally rewrite reality because of his sheer sunny disposition, like it all tracks, it all makes sense. It's
Yeah.
goofy as all heck, but we live in an era where like Marvel characters are changing history literally and like rewriting things to their
Yeah.
own whims. So I agree. It is like a very different storytelling.
Yeah.
But to me, the fact that it appears like that he actually had a plan
Yeah.
is kind of amazing in the era of like J.J. Abrams is my favorite punching bags in terms of like didn't have a plan, like
Mhm.
created an amazing mystery box and then like didn't know what to do when he opened it. Like it seems like Oda Sensei from the beginning of One Piece like had a certain vision, or at least like had started to like coalesce into a vision early on enough that that it's all fitting together, and that's kind of like one of the most mind-blowing things about a property that's gone on this long.
Yeah. No, I think it sounds fascinating. I'm in the same kind of way that I think understanding that the Vietnam War helps you to better understand MASH, I'm sure that better understanding the world of anime and the world of manga and just the world in which One Piece sits, not like the world that's created in the show, but just like culturally the world of its creation helps you understand that a lot more. So we'll make that episode one that comes up soon. There's a lot of other good episodes we're doing soon. To our members, as always, thank you all so much. You have been fantastic. We have spoken. And we're out.